The talk show host thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi flipped the conversation and left him scrambling for a comeback. The studio lights were blinding, hotter than she expected. Pam Bondi had been on television countless times, debated high-profile cases, stood before crowds of reporters. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quiet edge that sent a message before a single word was spoken. She adjusted her blazer, keeping her posture straight as she sat across from Graham Leighton, the host of the exchange, a sharp dresser with a reputation for pushing his guests to their limits. He was known for his aggressive questioning, his refusal to back down, and his tendency to turn interviews into public interrogations. Pam had been invited under the premise of a conversation about law, justice, and her time as Florida's Attorney General. But from the moment she walked onto the set, she could tell that wasn't the real plan. The energy in the room was off, cold, expectant, like the audience was waiting for a fight. She glanced toward them briefly, a sea of eager faces under dimmed house lights. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others sat stiffly, arms crossed, skeptical. A producer counted down from 3. The red light on the camera flickered on. Graham leaned in with a practiced smile, a tight-lipped expression that never quite reached his eyes. "Pam, welcome to the exchange," he said. She returned a polite nod. "Thank you for having me." His fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His voice was smooth but with an unmistakable bite. "You've been at the center of controversy for quite some time. Your tenure as Attorney General, your political stances. Some would say you've made decisions that hurt more people than they helped. Would you say that's fair?" There it was. No easing in. No warm-up. A sharp, pointed question right out of the gate. Pam had dealt with this kind of approach before, but something about Graham's tone made it clear he wasn't interested in a discussion. He was looking for a confrontation. She knew the audience had caught it too. She kept her expression neutral, unfazed. "I'd say that's an oversimplification of years of work, but if you'd like to discuss specifics, I'm happy to." Graham gave a tight smirk, tilting his head slightly. "Oh, we'll get to specifics," he said. He turned to the camera, as if addressing the audience directly. "But let's start with something simple. A lot of people, particularly those who've been affected by your policies, feel that you're out of touch with the realities of everyday Americans, that you've prioritized your own political gains over what's right. Do you ever stop to think about the people on the other side of your decisions?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait. Pam knew better than to bite. She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Every decision I've made has been with the intention of upholding the law and protecting citizens. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me, but leadership isn't about being liked. It's about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular." Graham let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's convenient. But let's be honest, Pam." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "Some would say you've turned a blind eye to justice when it suited you." The room felt smaller. The audience was dead silent now, hanging on every word. Pam remained still, her pulse steady. She'd seen this tactic before. Force an emotional reaction, make the guest defensive, get them flustered. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow breath and met his gaze directly. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham. I hope you'll allow me to actually answer your questions instead of just throwing accusations." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Graham's expression flickered, just for a second, but he wasn't finished. He was about to make things even uglier. Graham didn't miss a beat. He'd played this game before, controlled the pacing, steered the conversation, forced his guests into a corner before they even realized what was happening. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, as if settling in for a performance. "Pam, let's talk about power," he said. "People in your position, politicians, prosecutors, you all claim to serve justice. But it seems justice often bends for those who already have influence." Pam kept her posture firm, waiting. "For instance, when you were Attorney General, there were claims that corporate donors got special treatment, investigations that quietly disappeared. People who should have been held accountable walking away untouched. Can you look this audience in the eye and say that never happened?" A trap, cleverly worded. A denial would be met with skepticism. An admission, twisted beyond recognition. Pam exhaled through her nose, keeping her voice even. Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least have the integrity to be specific. What cases are you referring to? Graham smirked, turning toward the camera like he was performing for the viewers at home. Oh, we'll get specific. Don't worry. The audience chuckled, but it wasn't lighthearted. It was expectant, hungry for a slip-up. Pam could feel the rhythm of the conversation shifting, the temperature in the room rising. He was painting her as someone squirming under the pressure, when in reality she hadn't even begun to push back. Graham glanced down at a stack of papers in front of him. A prop. Whether or not he actually needed them was irrelevant. They gave the illusion of damning evidence waiting to be revealed. He flipped through them dramatically. Let's start with this, he said. Back in your tenure, there was a lawsuit against a certain corporation, one of your donors, mind you, accused of fraudulent business practices, and then suddenly that lawsuit vanished. What a coincidence. Pam's lips pressed together. Now she knew exactly what he was referring to and how he was twisting it. She started to speak, but Graham cut her off. Tell me, Pam, why should the American people believe that people like you don't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us get left behind? That landed like a punch, the audience murmured. Pam felt it immediately. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. A loaded question, designed to make her defensive, to force her into a soundbite he could use against her. She could see it in his eyes. He thought he had her, but he underestimated her. Pam inhaled slowly, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she leaned forward slightly. You know, Graham, it's interesting how you frame things. He blinked, just barely, but she caught it. You present this case like it's some scandal, when in reality, it was fully investigated, and the claims didn't hold up. No cover-up, no backroom deals, just the legal process playing out as it should. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted. She could hear whispers. The weight in the room had started to shift. But Graham wasn't done. He never expected a guest to roll over. And he knew how to keep pressing. So you're saying money never influenced any of your decisions? Pam met his stare. I'm saying facts did. And I find it interesting that instead of discussing those facts, you'd rather insinuate corruption with no proof. The audience reacted, some nodding, some still wary. But the tide wasn't as clearly in Graham's favor anymore. He could feel it too. So he changed tactics. His next question was about to get personal, and that's where he made his biggest mistake. Graham's smirk widened. He could feel the moment slipping, the weight of the conversation tilting against him, and he wasn't about to let that happen. If the political angle wasn't enough to rattle Pam, he had another card to play. He shifted in his seat, his voice taking on a more casual, almost amused tone. Let's put politics aside for a moment. Let's talk about character. Pam didn't react. She knew where this was going. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman who stands by her principles. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? The audience tensed. You talk about justice, about the law being fair, but do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Because a lot of people do. Pam knew exactly what he was referring to. It had been a hot summer evening. She had gone to see a documentary. Nothing political, nothing controversial. But outside the theater, a group of protesters had been waiting. They shouted insults, called her a disgrace, accused her of ignoring their concerns. Then as she walked past them, someone spat at her. It had been caught on camera and circulated for days. Some had called it justified outrage. Others had called it assault. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her voice controlled. Yes, I remember. Graham leaned in. People were angry. Some of them had lost everything because of policies you defended. And instead of engaging, you walked away. Some would say that's cowardly. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Pam felt a familiar frustration creeping in. He wasn't interested in the truth, just the most scandalous version of it. She exhaled slowly. Let's be clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed in public, where I was physically assaulted, Are you suggesting I should have stood there and taken it? Graham raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Pam continued, her voice sharper now.